Welcome to Author Stories, the podcast where we talk to the best writers in the industry and discuss writing and the creative process. Whether you're a writer, a reader, or both, we hope you'll find something here that makes you love books and the writers that create them. You can find archives of all of the great conversations I've had with authors over the years at hankgarner.com. Take some time and browse around there. I'm sure you'll find a new author to love, find inspiration for your own creative life, and find a new story to get lost in. Let's thank some sponsors who make the show possible. No Good Deed, Book 1 of the Mark Taylor Psychological Thriller series by M.P. McDonald, is free on Amazon.com. Seeing the future comes at a price. What price would you be willing to pay to save thousands of lives? Mark Taylor knows his actions scream guilty, but he was only trying to stop the horrible terrorist attack. Instead of a thank you, the government labels him an enemy combatant and throws him in the brig with no rights, no trial, and no way to prove his innocence. He learns firsthand that the CIA can do anything they want to him, anything at all. Mark's just a regular guy, a photographer, who finds himself in an extraordinary situation when an antique camera he buys at a dusty Afghanistan bazaar produces photographs of future tragedies he's driven to prevent. His frantic warnings about September 11th are ignored, but put him in the government crosshairs when he learns what being labeled an enemy combatant really means. Download this intense and gripping thriller now, free on Amazon. No Good Deed, Book 1 of the Mark Taylor Psychological Thriller series by M.P. McDonald. As the Crow Flies, Enter Haddonwood, Book 1 by Risa Walker and Caleb Ansel. From Risa Walker, the award-winning author of the best-selling Kronos Files, and debut author Caleb Ansel, comes a chilling story of altered reality and psychological terror. Chase Ray sits perfectly still, his thumbs traveling across the screen of the broken computer tablet, stuck in the nexus between two worlds. Haddonwood isn't real. It can't be. Another world, another reality, hovers just beyond his reach. He can see it sometimes. He can almost touch it. In that world, things are in balance. The dead stay dead and the creature feature remains safely on the screen. That world isn't a patchwork quilt of every scary book or movie he's seen. In that world, the nightmares generally end when you open your eyes and people don't glitch in and out of existence. Chase is determined to return to that world, although he's a bit worried that the only way out is through the noose that seems to lurk around every corner. He needs allies to get back home. But how do you choose your team when you can't tell who's real? As the Crow Flies, Enter Haddonwood, Book 1 by Risa Walker and Caleb Ansel. Simon Says, the John Simon Thriller, Book 1 by Brian Thomas Schmidt. Master Detective John Simon is a tough, streetwise 17-year veteran of the Kansas City Police Department with a healthy disdain for the encroachment of modern technology into his workplace. When his partner is kidnapped after a routine stakeout by thugs with seeming ties to connected, wealthy art dealer Benjamin Ashman, he's determined to find the truth. But the only witness is a humanoid android named Lucas George. Reluctantly, he takes Lucas along as he begins to investigate and soon finds himself depending more and more on the very technology he so distrusts. Meanwhile, Simon's precocious teenage daughter begins to teach Lucas how to sound more like a cop using dialogue from famous cop movies. If only he'd used them in the appropriate context. This exciting new mix of near-future science fiction and procedural thriller captures the gritty realism of Michael Connelly's Bosch, the humor and action of Lethal Weapon, and follows the classic science fiction tradition of Isaac Asimov's City of Steel. From the editor of the international best-selling phenomenon The Martian by Andy Weir, and the national best-selling author of tales including official entries in The X-Files, Predator, and the Joe Ledger thrillers, comes the action-packed first entry in an exciting new series. Be sure to pick up Simon Says by Brian Thomas Schmidt and get into this series on the ground floor. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm really excited to have Jodie Adams Kirshner on the show with me. She has a fantastic new book really thought-provoking. It's called Broke, Hardship and Resilience in a City of Broken Promises. And guys, this will have you look at the world around you and the people around you in a brand new way, I promise. Welcome to the show, Jodie.
Thank you for having me.
I'm excited to have you, Jodie. We begin each show with the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
When I was growing up, which was in Nashville, Tennessee, my very close friend's mother owned the big bookstore in town, and I would love going there, and I would love going to hear authors there. And she invited me to the National Storytelling Conference that takes place every year in Jonesboro, Tennessee. And often riding with my friend and her mother, we would pick up writers and pick up storytellers. And I think that might be where it dates back to.
Oh, I love that. Was there a particular author or book or series that you remember just really lighting your imagination on fire?
It's a very good question. I know that when I was little, I was definitely proud of reading very thick books. And I read Little Women younger than I probably should have, but was proud about the heft of it and would kind of show it off to parents' friends.
I love that. Did you ever have, aside from your time at the bookstore and with your friend and her mother, was there ever like a time in school where maybe you were challenged by something, or maybe a teacher recognized something in you and you were encouraged that this might be a path?
I'm having very clear memories when you ask this question that aren't in school, that are out of school, and how my mother would read to me while my brother, who's 3 years older, would have a guitar lesson. And I can remember sitting and kind of having the world of that book opened to me. But I have to say, I wouldn't have necessarily seen myself going down this path. It's sort of been a surprise to me. And it's just kind of an amazing surprise to have a book that's tangible and hitting the market right now. I don't know if you had asked me whether this was where I saw myself back when I was young, whether this would have been my answer.
Those are some of the best, though, when an idea or something kind of overtakes you and takes you in a new direction altogether. Those become some of the best things.
I hope so.
So what did you study, and what has been your path so far?
As an undergraduate, I studied environmental science and was very concerned about the policy side of what we were doing. And that led into going to journalism school, initially with an interest in more science writing. I had spent a semester of college in China, and I had lobbied hard to make a documentary film for a project for the program while I was there. And when I got back to college, I lobbied hard to make my college thesis a documentary film. And I had all sorts of ideas that if people understood science better, then they would be on board with advocating for all sorts of improved policies.
So the idea of communicating the ideas that you were passionate about, that's always been something that you've been interested in.
That has always been something that I've been interested in, and going beyond what would be an immediate technical audience to a scale where you could actually create some changes and have, I think I have a lot of belief that if people understand what another person's lived experiences, then people will get behind that and really, fight for something that's more fair and something that's better.
Yeah. You said that was those were things you were focused on as an undergrad. what happened from there?
Yes. So from there, I thought that maybe being academic was the platform to do that kind of work. And I went to law school with the idea of writing from an academic perch. And bankruptcy law really captured my interest and was what I wanted to be writing about. It's just the situation where you don't have enough to go around because there is something or someone that is insolvent, and how you try to make rules for when that happens, and how you try to create fair outcomes, and how you might take account of what different people and different relationships with the entity that ends up going bankrupt, and what they might be expected to know. It also feeds into questions about access to credit, which is the flip side of bankruptcy. It's taking on too much credit, but I mean, credit in reasonable amounts is how you get growth, and in excess can cause all sorts of bad outcomes. So access to credit is an important driver of inequalities and instabilities.
Your early interest in environmentalism and the environments that we live in and work in, and your interest in bankruptcy law, do you see a connection between those two? And do you see a linear path from your passion for one that led to another?
I mean, I compose things in retrospect, and then I think prospective, I think it's just sort of galvanizing challenges of our time, and how you get to good, just outcomes when facing those challenges. In retrospect, I mean, I could spin out all sorts of stories, and some of these are ideas for future projects. But I mean, if I were looking for one example, I mean, you've seen in recent years a lot of mining and energy companies going into bankruptcy, and that just seems the cutting edge of a lot of different changes in our economy and our energy economy, and how people can fit into the future and have skills for that future, and what it means for the regions that have depended on those industries. But that's something I'm doing some exploration of.
Sure. So thinking that academia might be the proper platform for this, how do you go about finding your place in that, and finding places where you can plug in and begin to make a difference?
Well, I think that's how I ended up writing the book. And so when Detroit was entering bankruptcy in 2013, I was firmly a law professor teaching and writing about bankruptcy law, and very much an advocate for the U.S. bankruptcy process. And I wanted to write about it, and I began going to Detroit and talking to people. And suddenly it just became so clear that all of the coverage that I was reading about it, it had dramatic headlines about mounting debt in Detroit and other cities like it, but nowhere in those stories was it talking about any of the people who lived in Detroit. And as further reporting came out, it really still wasn't addressing that question. And then really the bankruptcy process ended. Reporters and pundits kind of packed their bags and went home. And they hadn't been there long enough to really assess the impact, the human cost of bankruptcy on people. And so the idea was to not be in an academic perch. In an academic perch, bankruptcy is quite divorced from the human experience. It talks about creditors, not somebody who's been working in the police department in Detroit for their career. And so that drove me to set academic writing aside and write a much more broader audience book about the stories that I was being told when I was in Detroit.
Well, let's bring the audience up to speed just a little bit for folks that might not be as familiar with the story. So when we think about bankruptcy, I think just about all of us probably could think of a situation where someone we know or have been acquainted with, or we've all known of someone that's been in a situation like that, or have read about someone, and we understand kind of what personal bankruptcy is. But what does it mean when a city declares bankruptcy and the fallout from that? Because the city is made up of the people that live there, and we contribute to things to keep things running that we all share. But it also is kind of a weird place where the city is, we're also dependent on services, and it's a weird, a municipality is a weird kind of push and pull kind of situation. And when this entity goes bankrupt, what does that mean?
Well, you've raised a lot of the key points to cover in the question. I mean, bankruptcy in general, to start from the beginning, is you have an entity, so a person, a company, in this case a city, that is not able to pay its debts as they come due. And so if you enter into bankruptcy, you enter in a process of negotiation with all the people that are owed money. And really, the two key things that bankruptcy offers are that during the negotiation process, you don't have to pay the creditors yet. So you've got a freeze on anything happening with those bills. That can be a benefit of bankruptcy. And the other thing is that creditors that are of the same kind, that have similar kinds of claims against the bankrupt entity, vote on whatever gets negotiated. And you just need a threshold vote. You don't need 100% of the creditors. So you can come to a majority consensus and then force that on all of the creditors. Outside of bankruptcy, you might get into a situation where you've got the one creditor who's holding out any kind of deal that could otherwise go through. So that's what bankruptcy can do. You'll notice that there's a lot in there that bankruptcy can't do. The kind of things that usually get negotiated with creditors are paying back the money over a longer time horizon, or paying it back in a different way, paying back a little less of it. And in the case of a city, it usually goes along with some other things to get the budget back in balance, like cutting services, selling some property. But as you say, this is all also a bit weird with a city. I mean, it's not a company. It can never say, this whole thing isn't working. We need to liquidate. We need to shut ourselves down. The city isn't going to shut itself down. And a lot of what the city is providing is very essential services like water, trash collection, public education. So bankruptcy for cities sits somewhat uncomfortably in the law. I mean, the bankruptcy code had been around for a long time before it was amended to include cities. That was done around the time of the Great Depression. And bankruptcy really wasn't used very much for cities at all until the wake of the recent financial crisis. And when it was used, it wasn't used for really broad-scale challenges like a city like Detroit faced around the time of its bankruptcy. It was used for a city that, say, had to pay a legal judgment and didn't know how to afford it. So it's a very new use of bankruptcy on a city like Detroit and other cities that were going through bankruptcy in the wake of the crisis at the same time, Vallejo, California, Stockton, California.
So what's interesting about Broke is that you give us some insightful perspectives of what's going on with Detroit and what goes on after all of the legal wranglings are over, and who's left to deal with the fallout of everything, and to make the most of what they're left with. And not only do we get the kind of overall picture of the city's story, but then you give us insight into the people that are affected here, and you chose to do that through several people and families in the city. You were there to kind of witness the bankruptcy process, but then, like you said, you wanted to be more than just one of the journalists who wrote the story, packed up, and left, and didn't do the follow up of what happens next. When did the idea for the shape of this book come about, and how the unique view that you give us of the city and its people?
The whole purpose of writing the book was to show the human cost of bankruptcy. I've just had a very long-winded answer about what bankruptcy is and what it does. And in a way, you could sum up the book as saying 7 people to show exactly what bankruptcy can't do. And I gathered the people slowly and over time and set about following them. And I was surprised by everything that happened to them during the 3 years that I was in very close touch with them. I originally started with the idea of looking at people around the issue of real estate, because that was a clear issue that revitalization depended on, and bankruptcy had seemed to be not really the correct tool to be helpful, and also in instances to be harmful around that. So I started there and was talking to people specifically about housing. And housing is a large part of a municipal budget as well. It's the source of property tax revenues. But then from there, with the people that I was already talking to, from there I began to explore other issues on which an urban revitalization also depends. Transportation, jobs, education, follow-on issues.
How did you choose the 7 people that you follow in the book?
Some of it was mutual. There were people that I met that seemed like they had stories to tell and surprising things happening to them, but that didn't count for much if they weren't also happy to be with me for the next long time, really. So I chose them, and they also chose me.
Gotcha. When you're an outsider, I know you grew up in Nashville, and you're not based in Detroit. How do you go about, becoming a member of the community there, so that people trust you and that you build a rapport, and that you can, give an honest look at the community, instead of, like we've said before, being a journalist who comes in, gives a narrow window of what's going on, and then moves on to the next story?
I was very self-conscious about that, and I was very aware of myself as someone who was an outsider, who wasn't living in the city in the same way. And I hope I navigated that well. I was open about it. I mentioned it a lot. I hope that somehow it did create some objectivity, because I think there are a lot of very deep-seated and ingrained politics that I could leap over and not get as entrenched in. I also feel like there's just something very powerful in spending time with people and listening to them and wanting to hear what they are saying. And I think particularly, one of the people I follow in the book is a single mother in her late 20s. And she just often said that she really didn't have a lot of people to really talk to, that she woke up very early in the morning to get her daughter to school, and then to commute an hour to the suburbs where she worked at a call center. I mean, just so much of her life was in doing tasks that she didn't have all that many people to just talk about what was going on in her life with.
When you start thinking about the book, and I know that you said that the idea of writing this came really ahead of the time you spent there. How do you start planning out what the scope of the book is going to be, and as you're interviewing people and following along with people's lives, how do you make sure that you're staying on task with the story that you intended to tell from the beginning?
What a good question. I do have to confess that I remember on some of my early on time, and I was staying at an Airbnb in Detroit at that point with a very kind Airbnb host who was asking me how my day went, and just having this sense of complete overwhelmness that how was I going to write a book about an entire city and over the years of the bankruptcy and then the aftermath, and how did you do that? And then I also would often have a worry that somehow to come up with any solutions to include in the book, I was somehow needing to solve all of the big questions in our country, which I was certainly not qualified to do. But I tried to really, really keep close to the 7 people and what they were going through and how they answered what bankruptcy can and can't do, and how it's very different for them to be living there than to be living in other parts of the country where the level of their opportunities would just inevitably look different. Because I think that that's the key problem, is that difference and that unequal access to opportunities.
When you're following people and you've got a great scope of participants in the book, and a really varied cast of characters, if you will, and we see challenges of all sorts, but we also see victories of all sorts throughout the book. And one thing that I love about this book is that it's not just a dismal view of a failed city, if you will. It's really about the resilience of the people, that even in the midst of these hardships, some days we have good days and some days they're not good days. Some days we're heroes and some days we are, ones in need of rescue. As you're collecting these stories, does a narrative start to unfold for you? And is there a particular plan that you have to convey, people's stories and keep them honest, but to show not just the bad, but the good as well?
I think you're right. And I think that's another point, that in all of this, there are winners and losers, and it really depends on who you are. So another one of the 7 people that I follow is Joe, who's moved to Detroit from New Jersey with some capital, definitely talent, definitely ideas. And his daughter, who is in her 20s, ends up coming and joining him in Detroit. And I mean, she is very successful there. She works at a downtown restaurant as a bartender and earns more money in tips than she did when she was working in Manhattan. She goes on to work at a distillery and then waitressing at a high-end new restaurant, and buys a house for $500 that she loves, and she gardens and she uses the empty land near the house. And so I think what I was trying to do in the writing was to do some juxtapositions and to have issues echoing themselves around the 7 people, and then the people like Joe's daughter who were sort of satellites and aren't followed throughout the whole book. And so that it could lead to some comparisons off the page of why things were different. And also I include somebody who's trying to invest in property, and you can see him juxtapose against somebody who would perhaps want a job from him working in construction, and just see the dualities going on in the 2 points of view.
You alluded to something a few minutes ago, Jodie, that I want to ask you about, and that's going into a project like this and not having the answers to make everything better. And I think a lot of us, want to be problem solvers. And when you are around a situation like this, some people would be tempted to, come up with their own answers to how we can fix all of this. Broke does not try to fix all of the problems. Is that a temptation when writing, a story like this to try to have answers, to try to give people comfort in the end that, this has been a bad situation, but it could be better if we did this, and to not be preachy about what your views are on how this could all play out better. Is that something to, not that you're preachy, I didn't mean that, but that's an inclination we have to want to give our opinions about things and let our personal politics or whatever play into the story of these people.
I'm glad to hear that it doesn't come off that way. I did include some suggested solutions in the epilogue, and I felt like that was important to not just leave it entirely in the stories, but to have some other ideas. I mean, my hope is that by reading the book and by understanding more and more deeply about what's happened in Detroit, that it will help us all to push for better outcomes for other cities like it in the future. I thought you were going to be asking about whether in spending time with people who at times were having problems that, well, let me start that over again. I thought you were going to ask about whether in spending time with people intimately and seeing their problems, whether it was hard to be objective and to be simply writing about them and not trying to intervene in their own life. And
that's where I was going next.
That was admittedly extremely hard for me. And what I ended up doing was trying to help, but after I had already put in place a lot of the text for that. So I did spend some time doing some legal research, and I did spend time looking for some pro bono counsel. But I tried to do that in a way that also wouldn't affect what had been written in the book.
Well, it would be difficult to be an objective observer, but knowing that you had resources that you could help people plug into, that's a difficult place to be.
And it is where the ethics class that I took long ago in journalism school was so I kept returning to it. Yes.
Yeah. Well, the book Broke is out everywhere now when you're hearing this. Hardship and Resilience in a City of Broken Promises. Jodie, I was pleasantly surprised by this book. I didn't know what I was getting when I first started reading it, and what a powerful tale. Getting to walk alongside people as they go through tragic situations like this, and seeing some glimmers of hope, but also seeing some places where maybe I need to be more observant about the community around me. It's really a great work that you've done here with Broke, and I hope it reaches lots of people.
Oh, thank you. It's exciting just seeing it in the hands of one and you, and knowing that you've read it. Thank you for spending time with it.
Absolutely. There's a link to the book where you can buy it in the show notes of this episode. Jodie, if people are just learning about you and your work, is there a place where they can connect with you online?
Yes, I have a website that is jodieadamskirshner.com, and Jodie is with an IE, and Kirshner is just SH, no C.
Gotcha. We will put links to all that in the show notes, send everyone to see you and to pick up their copy of Broke. Jodie, thank you so much for taking time to come on the show today.
Thank you for inviting me on and spending time talking to me.
Now stay tuned for an audiobook excerpt from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series.
You took a terrible risk tonight.
Why?
You don't know? The first rule.
I was told by a friend that I shouldn't reveal my gift to anyone who doesn't have a gift themselves.
That's exactly right.
Because everyone we tell dies.
Yes, you might have marked me for death.
Made you a target for a ghost. Why can't people know what we can do? What makes it so dangerous? Valerie took up the fireplace prongs and stabbed the logs.
It's called the Great Curse.
Sparks exploded from glowing crevices and drizzled upwards, ricocheting off the black belly of the cauldron, turning into tiny ashes that disappeared up the chimney.
It was cast by a powerful witch over 300 years ago.
Witch? Sorry, but witch? Please, there's no such thing. Valerie closed her eyes. A spoon leapt from Jason's dish and caught him in the temple. He wiped melted ice cream from his cheek. You were saying?
She cast the curse to stop the witch trials.
In Salem? Jason searched his memory.
1692. They burned her alive in the Salem Common. The only witch to be burned.
The cauldron smoked slightly. Its contents had evaporated. A sharp, charred scent filled the room. Wait, said Jason. There were no witches. They were just, victims of religious hysteria, right? So you're saying the witch trials were justified?
Justified? So if a witch did exist, it would be okay to kill her?
No, I just thought... You're right. Never mind.
There was one witch in Salem, at least. A woman with a powerful gift. She only wanted to protect people like us. To give the gifted their anonymity, refuge. She cast the Great Curse as she burned. She proclaimed that mortals who know a witch shall know death. And that is the Great Curse. And it's still in effect after all this time.
Mortal, as in...
Non-gifted. No mortal can know about you, about any authentic witch.
Jason winced. Isn't there another word besides that? She shrugged. So no one can know what I am, what I can do, or else they become a target.
Right. The spirit world will obey the Great Curse and try to kill them.
The spirit world.
The other realm.
Jason rubbed his eyes. How much of this was reality and how much of this was Valerie's nutty brand of mysticism? He felt himself pulling back, as usual, for fear of contagion. He'd spent his whole life reading science fiction. He hated paranormal tales. This was not his genre.